Thanks for sticking around to the end of our long but fun day, kicking off Salina Reads. So this year, for Salina Reads, we were fortunate enough to receive a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts, a big read grant, and that's made it possible for us to do all the activities that we did today and all the activities coming up throughout the month. So we really strove to bring in some quality and meaningful programs throughout the day and the month. So our novel this year that we're focusing on is True Grit by Charles Portis. It is a Western pioneer themed story about a young girl, Maddie Ross, who's 14, and she travels with U.S. Marshal Rooster Cogburn and Texas Ranger LaBeef through what they called in the book and at that time Indian Territory, to track down her father's killer. And it is, of course, a fictional, it's a novel, but it highlights the truth of the times that Native Americans, including those who lived in the area that is now Salina and Saline County, were being relocated to this Indian Territory, which today we would consider mostly Oklahoma. So as we read True Grit and we're exploring the theme Where We Live, which is something that's a requirement of the National Endowment for the Arts grant, we do want to acknowledge and respect the several tribal nations, including but not limited to the Kaw, also known as the Kanza, Osage, Comanche, Pawnee, and Dakota peoples on whose traditional homelands we reside. So today, as a celebration of the heritage of the indigenous Americans on this land where we live, we are welcoming Dr. Eric Anderson of Haskell Indian Nations University and Storm Brave, who is the language director of the Kaw Nation, both to help us better understand the history and the heritage of indigenous peoples of Kansas and also of this community space. So we're going to begin with Dr. Anderson. He's going to speak to us about Native American history pertaining to the state of Kansas as a whole. Dr. Anderson holds a doctorate in American history from the University of Kansas, specializing in American Indian cultures and the history of the United States West. He is an enrolled member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation and teaches at Haskell Indian Nation University in Lawrence, Kansas. His major research focus is on American Indian education, especially the system of federal boarding schools established for Native youth in the late 19th century. He's currently working on projects about the history of Haskell Institute, as well as a textbook examining American Indian cultures and history. And he will be followed by Storm Brave, and I'll tell you a little bit more about her a little bit later. So welcome, Dr. Anderson.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you to the Salina Library. Thank you, National Endowment for the Arts, for making all this possible. Thanks to you for being here, choosing to spend some time on one of those strange Kansas weather days. Can't really decide what it's going to do. So, can you all hear me okay? Okay. If you're having trouble, just put your hand to your ear and I will ramp up that teacher's voice, okay? So as Stephanie said, I'm going to talk to you kind of generally about American Indian people in this place that we now call Kansas. And I'm going to focus on, as the talk says, a couple of ideas. Diversity and complexity. Because I think those are important. Many times when people think about indigenous Americans, Native people here in North America, there's a tendency maybe to lump them together culturally or not realize that there are many distinctions in terms of culture, heritage, beliefs, traditions, practices, things like that. And also this idea of complexity. Most of us perhaps, are products of public school education where we didn't get a lot of information about Native people, or they only trotted it out a few times a year. And I think part of the oversight there is there was a lot of baked in bias. bias is very old, and Indian cultures were dismissed as being simple. We're backwards. I noticed looking around at some of the exhibits out there, looking at Kiowa and one of their leaders, Santanta, has used the word savage to think about what that might mean and what's implicitly biased about it. So oftentimes that idea of savagery versus civilization is an example of dismissing the cultural complexity of Native people. So I kind of want to focus on that. I want to start with this picture, which I would say is pretty stereotypical of American Indians. It's George Catlin. It's a very beautiful painting. Catlin spent a lot of times with different cultures, and he did recognize distinctions in them. But this might be an image that many of us have when we think about Plains Indians, right? The horse, the buffalo, the bow and arrow. Certainly, those things are present in Kansas. A couple of them are introductions to Native people, but these are not the only examples of Native culture, even though it might be what we kind of conjure up when we think about Native people on the plains or in Kansas specifically. And next I want to go to this map. Historians love maps, so I'm going to have a few of them in there. I had one at the beginning just with the state of Kansas. This is a map, and let me put the emphasis on the word a map of Indian Kansas. It's not the only one, maybe not necessarily the best one, but it illustrates some things that I think are worth noting. And I put Kansas as a crossroads. This would probably represent the majority, not all, but the majority of Native groups who were here at the time when Europeans began to make their way out onto the plains and into this area that we call Kansas today. There are more ancient indigenous people who are not represented here. There are people who passed through, didn't really reside here necessarily, but certainly came through the area. They're not on this map. There are people who came later, and we'll look at another map and think about some comparison points. But with regard to this one, starting in the north central, you see the Pawnee people, and of course these borders are arbitrary. These are not borders that were recognized traditionally by indigenous groups. It gives a rough overlay of what we think about as Kansas today. So the Pawnee is kind of in that northern area. They're also very closely associated with kind of the Platte and Republican River areas in Nebraska, what's today Nebraska. And then as we make our way into the eastern portion, northeast, Kansa, Kaw people, how do you say it? Kansi?
Gonzi.
Kansi, okay. And then to the, let me get my directions here. Southeast, the Osage people, people in Middle Waters, going across to the southwest, Kiowa and Comanches, to the north of them, Arapahoes, and then Cheyennes. So these are rough estimations. This territorial occupation is a little bit more fluid than it might look, okay? Particularly as the pursuit of resources comes into play. So I want to start with the Kansas people, or the people of the South Wind, as they conceive of themselves. These, of course, are the people where the state gets its name. Right? Sometimes also called the Kaw. Originally located in the area west of Topeka. A little bit later, kind of compressed to the area around what's Council Grove. And this is the seal of the sovereign nation of the Kaw. I might add that some of these things are very much adaptations as Europeans, Euro-Americans came into the orbit of Native people who were already here, or even as they were removed to new places, Native groups sometimes felt compelled to adapt things that Europeans used. So a seal like this would not have been traditional, but I think it does represent some of the traditional culture of the Claw people. I'm going to run through these kind of quickly because I want to leave time for questions or comments. And we can always circle back to these things. So what you have here are a couple of photographs on the top of Kansas tribal representatives, diplomats, going to Washington, D.C. to advocate for themselves in terms of their needs, their sovereignty, their nationhood. So again, think about that idea of complexity. These are complex people, people who have all of the attributes of any Western nation or culture. That they are sovereign, they occupy a territory, they have a political, economic, diplomatic kind of structure. And then on the bottom is the commission. This is in Council Grove. This has been recently restored. I haven't had a chance to go over and visit it since that's been renovated. But this is something that was established by outsiders to change Native people. There's a long history in this country, and even before it was a country, to try and change the cultures of Native people. One principal way, of course, is through religion, through Christianity. And the Claw Mission was established quite early, and I'll point out probably a couple of other missions. There's a kind of an old saying, commerce follows the missionary. The missionaries were some of the first non-Native people to come out here. And that was very much on their agenda, was to change Native people. And they had mixed success with that, I guess, if we use the word success loosely. They did win some converts at times. Sometimes people converted for different reasons, as coping mechanisms for big changes like disease and encroachment on territory. Sometimes that conversion was a surface conversion. And sometimes Native people converted for reasons that might benefit them economically. Sometimes they resisted conversion. Sometimes they blended traditions of Native and newcomer. The Claw Mission, I don't think, was very successful. Yes, some Claw children attended there, mostly boys. The Kansas people weren't real excited about sending their young women there, not because they didn't want them educated, but because they had a concern for them. And by and large, I think the thing they probably liked the most about the mission was the food, not what was being taught. And so I would say, if from the missionary point of view, it had pretty limited success. If we go next to the Osage, or people of the Middle Water people, it's kind of a mistranslation through the French. The Osage are a group that some historians have referred to as Imperial Indians. And another one would be the Comanches, who we'll talk about in a minute. I don't know that I really like that terminology. Again, thinking about complexity, maybe it's useful because yes, the Osage commanded a very large swath of territory, far exceeding the borders of what we would think of as Kansas today. And as you can see, I don't know how well you can see it from the back, but that extended into what's now Missouri, Oklahoma, Texas, parts of Louisiana. It might be a useful term to think about in light of what we could think of as complexity, an organized structure that overlays a wide swath of territory, but I don't think it's useful as a synonym for what Europeans would have thought of as empire, where you're actually kind of exacting tribute, where you're controlling other groups of people. To some extent that's true, but I don't think it's a one-for-one application. Okay, so again, maybe thinking about complexity, the Osage are certainly complex, but were they really operating an empire in the way we might think of something like the Roman Empire? They did have, again, I'm using that word loosely, a big, huge amount of territory that they were able to occupy and to a certain extent control. They had a centralized government, complexity, and they organized their life principles, true of many of these native groups, around a complex spiritual belief system. One reason I'm not in love with the term empire in the way that we normally think about it is Kansas is a place that really has no natural bodies of water in terms of lakes. Of course, there are rivers. It did, though, at one time have a natural springs, and the Osage called it Wakanda. And Wakanda is their kind of operating system of thinking about creation, life force. Now, if it was an empire, like the Roman Empire, maybe they would control access to that water. But they didn't. They realized everyone has to have water to survive. So, even if they were at war with other groups, and they often were, particularly the Pawnees, they still gave them access to what was a natural spring. And Wakanda was famous to this place, to Europeans and Euro-Americans, as a natural body of water that wasn't a river. And it became kind of a resort area where people would go for the healing waters, and hotels and other things sprung up there later. And eventually they dammed it open, so it no longer exists in the way that the Osage would have recognized it. The Pawnees, and by the way, the Osage lived in kind of a roundhouse structure. Pawnees live in earth lodges. Again, I've used some of these European interpretations or Euro-American interpretations of lifestyles from these artists. A lot of the people indigenous to Kansas by the time Europeans began to show up on the plains were dependent on buffaloes. But the Pawnees are very distinct because they're farmers. They're principally farmers. And again, going back to that concept of diversity, that makes them different than a lot of their neighbors in native Kansas. They also did conduct semi-annual buffalo hunts. And in that Catlin painting, you see the Pawnee hunters sneaking up on these very perplexed looking buffalo, disguising themselves as animals, as wolves. I wonder what the buffalo are thinking. And then this chart over here, and it's probably pretty hard to tell, gives you an idea of what native people, how they utilized the buffalo. And we've all heard that old adage that they never wasted anything. Well, I mean, that's true, but that's a matter of survival, using all of these parts. They certainly weren't hunting them willy-nilly. They had very organized buffalo hunts that were essentially policed, monitored internally, so that you're not doing things like killing during mating season, or taking the young buffalo. It's an example of many of the different uses. It's not an exhaustive list. And I want to also make a point here that for Native people, the buffalo, as with other animals, plants, are seen as relatives rather than resources. So there would have been very prescribed ceremonies and practices that went into the hunt, so that you were making sure not only be careful about protecting what we might think of as a resource so that it's replenished, but also recognizing the sacrifices that the animals are making. So there's this reciprocal kind of relationship, as opposed to, you've probably all seen the pictures, I put one on here, what was happening in the late 19th century in places like Kansas with the huge several story stacks of buffalo bones, where that was being exhausted as a resource and kind of a fad for things like buffalo tongues and buffalo hides, but also as a means of destroying what the native people depended on. The Pawnees also have a very complex spiritual belief system. Again, I'm going through these things pretty quickly. We could drill down on them a lot more. But for the Pawnees, they had a very deep knowledge of astronomy, star knowledge. They saw themselves as being descendants of the stars. This is a buffalo hide, I guess you would say, kind of cosmological map. And it's circular, which is important in the native way of thinking, as opposed to more linear that Europeans or Western people conceive things as. And they're kind of a hierarchical society, in that if you are seen as a descendant of one of the more important stars, like the morning star, you have a kind of a higher status in that society. So just as with the other groups, they have their own traditions, they have their own distinctions, whether it's spiritually, economically, politically, or even in very visible ways like their housing structures. They got that very distinct Pawnee haircut there in that picture as well. What we might kind of think of as a mohawk, but it's distinct even from that. The Cheyennes are a group that maybe more people have heard of than some of the others. And the Cheyennes have a very wide range as well. They are, by the time they come out into the plains, originally they were agricultural people, but they're very much buffalo hunters by the time they make their way out to the plains. There are northern and southern divisions, going up to the high plains, descending, as far up as Montana, and the southern branches of the Cheyennes going down to what's now Texas. They would come together for semi-annual hunts and kind of family reunions and things of that nature. That division got accentuated more and more with the railroad coming in, which divided not only the people but the buffalo herds on which they depended. The Cheyennes and the Arapahoes, remember on that map I showed you of Indian Kansas, we're talking about now kind of in the range of western Kansas. It's not as neat as that, but the Arapahoes and the Cheyennes are very closely allied and very continuously at war with the Pawnees. The Pawnees make kind of an easy target, right? Because they're settled in villages most of the time, and they have stores of corn and other things that they're growing as horticulturalists. So they're getting raided a lot, not just by the Cheyennes and Arapahoes, but also the Osage and others. They also maybe fit the bill to our stereotypical vision of that Catlin painting I showed you, as horsemen or horse people. They integrate the horse into their cultures. Again, I think the idea of adaptation is important. They just don't do a one-for-one. They're not using the horse exactly the same way that Europeans or Euro-Americans are. It's being integrated into their societies, spiritually, economically, and culturally. Of course, the Cheyennes, you probably know in terms of the Battle of Little Bighorn. That would have been one of those times that Indians get trotted out in our public school education. So they were allied also with the so-called Sioux people. And when Stephanie did the land acknowledgement, which I'll kind of circle back to at the end, Sioux is not what they called themselves. A lot of these names are not what Native people called themselves. They are misnomers, mispronunciations, bastardizations of their names on how outsiders heard them. Sioux is a French word. The Nez Perce tribe, not in Kansas, but Pierced Nose. They saw pierced noses, they called them Nez Perce. No Indian group would call themselves Gros Ventre. You know what that means, large belly. Right. The Osage, the Comanche, all of these groups have their own names for themselves. And I think that's important too, because that's kind of where a lot of the misconceptions and the lack of thinking about complexity come into mind. When my nation encountered the French very early on, and they said, "Who are you?" and we said, "What means?" They said, "Oh, Potawatomi." And that stopped. That's not what we said. The Kiowas and Comanches represent another couple of groups that are very closely allied, but they're separate and distinct from one another. And again, we're thinking about kind of the southwestern area of what's today Kansas. They're another one of these groups who are referred to as imperial or commanding an empire, sometimes called Comancheria. So it way exceeds the area of Kansas. Again, I'm not totally satisfied with using that stamp of empire, but to some extent it fits in terms of overseeing a very large territorial area. Something else, when I was looking around out there at the exhibits that came up, was treaties. And Satanta, the Kiowa leader, was one of these Kansas native headmen who was at the Treaty of Medicine Lodge. Medicine Lodge is more than one treaty. There's a town in Kansas called Medicine Lodge. It commemorates this series of treaties that were signed in the late 1860s. In fact, it's one of the very last group of treaties that the United States